Burt Reynolds and Inger Stevens share one of Hollywood's most tragic and mysterious final chapters. Their connection came during the filming of the TV movie Simon, run in 1970, a project that would become Stevens' last screen appearance. What began as a professional collaboration soon evolved into a deeply personal and reportedly turbulent relationship. BY 1970. Stevens was a respected actress with a successful career behind her, but privately, she was struggling. Despite her glamorous image, she battled loneliness, emotional instability, and the pressures of Hollywood. Reynolds, meanwhile, was a rising star, charismatic, ambitious, and just beginning to break through. Their romance was intense, passionate, and, according to many accounts, often stormy. Reports suggest that on the evening of April 29, 1970, the two had a serious argument. Reynolds allegedly left Stevens' home after the confrontation. Later that night, Stevens reportedly called a close associate, mentioning that she had argued with Burt, had a few glasses of wine, and planned to take a sleeping pill before going to bed. It would be the last known conversation she had. The next morning, Stevens was discovered on the floor of her Hollywood Hills home by her friend and companion, Lola McNally. She was still alive, barely conscious, and attempted to speak, but no words came out. She died in the ambulance on the way to the hospital. The scene immediately raised questions. There was a small cut on her chin, covered by a bandage, and an abrasion on her arm, details that fueled speculation for decades. The Los Angeles County coroner, Dr. Thomas Noguchi, determined that Stevens died from acute barbiturate poisoning. Her death was officially ruled a suicide, yet the circumstances surrounding it have remained the subject of debate ever since. Was it a deliberate act, an accidental overdose, or the devastating result of emotional despair following a painful confrontation? Reynolds was never accused of wrongdoing, and there has never been any evidence suggesting he was directly responsible for Stevens' death. Still, because he was one of the last people known to have seen her alive, his name became forever linked to the tragedy. It's the kind of Hollywood association no one wants, like being remembered as a final chapter in someone else's heartbreaking story. What makes this story even more poignant is that Stevens had long struggled with depression. Friends describe her as sensitive, intelligent, and deeply vulnerable beneath her polished exterior. She had also kept a major secret from the public: her marriage to Ike Jones, which was hidden for years due to fears about how an interracial marriage might affect her career in that era. That secrecy only added to the emotional burden she carried. For Reynolds, Stevens' death remained a painful subject. He rarely spoke publicly about it. That silence has only intensified public fascination, but it may also reflect a profound impact the event had on him. Sometimes silence says more than any interview ever could. In the end, Burt Reynolds' role in Inger Stevens' death was not one of guilt, but of tragic proximity. He was part of her final hours, not the cause of her final decision. Their relationship was real, complicated, and deeply human, filled with passion, conflict, and perhaps unspoken pain. The mystery surrounding Inger Stevens endures not because the facts are unclear, but because the emotions behind them remain impossible to fully understand. Hollywood often remembers its brightest stars for how they shined. In Stevens' case, many also remember the shadow her loss left behind. Her death marked the end of a remarkable career, and the loss of a woman whose talent, beauty, and complexity were far greater than the tragedy that ended her life. And for Burt Reynolds, it became one of the saddest footnotes in a life otherwise filled with extraordinary highs. The tragedy of Inger Stevens becomes even more haunting when you look at the final months of her life. On the surface, she appeared to have everything: a successful acting career, international fame, and a beauty that made her one of Hollywood's most admired stars. But behind the cameras and red carpets, Stevens was carrying burdens few people fully understood. BY 1970. Her career was at a crossroads. While she had enjoyed tremendous success in television with The Farmer's Daughter and memorable roles in films alongside some of Hollywood's biggest names, she was also facing the difficult reality of an industry that often moved on quickly. New stars were emerging, and Stevens was working hard to reinvent herself. Her final project, Simon, opposite Burt Reynolds, was meant to be a fresh start, a chance to reestablish herself with a new generation of audiences. During filming, Stevens and Reynolds reportedly grew close. Their relationship was said to be passionate, but also complicated. Both were strong personalities, and their romance was far from smooth. Friends and insiders described it as intense, the kind of relationship that could swing from affection to conflict in a matter of moments. For Stevens, who was already emotionally vulnerable, such volatility may have been especially difficult. What many people didn't know at the time was that Stevens had spent years battling depression. She had reportedly struggled with feelings of loneliness and insecurity, despite the admiration she received from the public. Hollywood can be an isolating place, especially for someone as private and sensitive as Stevens. The gap between her glamorous public image and her private pain had grown wider over the years. There was also the secret she had kept hidden from nearly everyone, her marriage to Ike Jones. The two had married in 1961, but the union remained concealed because of fears that an interracial marriage could damage her career during that era. Imagine carrying such an enormous secret for nearly a decade. That kind of emotional strain would weigh heavily on anyone on the night before her death. Stevens reportedly had a heated argument with Reynolds. Accounts differ on the details, but it is widely believed that the disagreement left her deeply upset. Later, she is said to have spoken with a friend, mentioning the argument and saying she intended to take a sleeping pill after having some wine. It seemed like an ordinary enough statement at the time. Tragically, it would prove to be anything but ordinary. The following morning, Stevens was found collapsed on the kitchen floor of her Hollywood Hills home. Her companion, Lola McNally, discovered her barely conscious. Stevens reportedly opened her eyes, tried to lift her head, and attempted to speak, but no words came out. It was a heartbreaking final moment, one that has lingered in Hollywood lore for decades. She died on the way to the hospital. The official cause of death was acute barbiturate poisoning. The coroner ultimately ruled it a suicide. Yet, as with many tragic celebrity deaths, questions remained. Was it a deliberate act? Was it an accidental overdose brought on by emotional distress? Or was it a desperate cry for help that went tragically too far? Because Reynolds was one of the last people known to have seen her alive, his name became permanently tied to the story. But there has never been any evidence that he was directly involved in her death. His connection was one of timing, not culpability. Still, being the final romantic chapter in someone's life, especially one that ends in tragedy, is a burden that likely stayed with him forever. Interestingly, Reynolds rarely discussed Stevens publicly in later years. That silence has often been interpreted as a sign of lingering pain. Some experiences are simply too personal, too heartbreaking, or too complicated to revisit in interviews. And frankly, who could blame him? Inger Stevens' death also exposed the darker side of Hollywood. The immense pressures placed on actors, especially women, to maintain an image of perfection while hiding their struggles. She was expected to be beautiful, poised, and endlessly composed, even while dealing with private turmoil that few could see. Today, Stevens is remembered not only for the mystery surrounding her death, but for the remarkable talent she brought to the screen. Her performances in classics like The Farmer's Daughter, Hang 'Em High, and The Twilight Zone continue to resonate with audiences. She possessed a rare combination of elegance, vulnerability, and emotional depth. As for Burt Reynolds, his role in this story remains that a man who happened to be part of Stevens' final chapter. He was not the author of her fate, but he was undeniably a significant figure in her last days. Their relationship, like so many in Hollywood, was passionate, imperfect, and deeply human. And perhaps that is why this story continues to fascinate people decades later. It isn't just about fame, mystery, or tragedy. It's about two people, both talented, both flawed, caught in a moment of profound emotional complexity. One would go on to become a Hollywood legend. The other would become one of Hollywood's most heartbreaking what-ifs. Inger Stevens left behind a legacy of beauty, talent, and unanswered questions. And while the circumstances of her death may never be fully understood, her life, and the impact she had on those who knew her, including Burt Reynolds, continues to be remembered. What makes Inger Stevens' story so unforgettable is not just the mystery surrounding her death, but the extraordinary contrast between the life she projected and the pain she privately endured. To millions of fans, she was a picture of grace and sophistication, a poised actress with a warm smile, effortless beauty, and a screen presence that seemed almost luminous. Yet behind that polished image was a woman who often felt profoundly alone. Born in Sweden and raised between two worlds, Stevens experienced hardship long before Hollywood ever came calling. Her mother died when Inger was still a child, a devastating loss that left a permanent mark on her emotional life. She later moved to the United States, where she had to adapt to a new culture, a new language, and a new identity. That kind of upheaval can shape a person forever. For Stevens, it seemed to instill both remarkable resilience and a deep sense of vulnerability. That be why the time she found fame, Stevens had become one of television's brightest stars. Her role in The Farmer's Daughter made her a household name, and audiences adore her natural charm. Unlike many actresses of the era, she brought an authenticity to her performances that made her feel relatable. Even while she possessed movie star glamour, she was not merely admired. She was beloved, but fame has a peculiar way of magnifying loneliness. The more people adored Stevens from afar, the more isolated she sometimes appeared in her personal life. Friends often describe her as thoughtful, introspective, and deeply sensitive. She was known for her intelligence and wit, but also for periods of melancholy that could be difficult to shake. Her secret marriage to Ike Jones only added to that sense of isolation. For nearly a decade, Stevens lived with the burden of concealing one of the most important relationships in her life. In the social climate of the 1960s, an interracial marriage could provoke public backlash and threaten a career. So the couple kept their union hidden, a decision born out of necessity, but one that undoubtedly came at a personal cost. Imagine being unable to openly acknowledge the person you love most. It's enough to make anyone feel like they're living two separate lives, one for the world and one in the shadows. Then came Burt Reynolds. At the time, Reynolds was on the cusp of superstardom, brimming with confidence, charm, and that unmistakable swagger that would later make him one of Hollywood's biggest icons. His relationship with Stevens was reportedly passionate and intense. They were drawn to one another, perhaps because they recognized something familiar in each other: ambition, sensitivity, and a certain emotional complexity. Yet intense relationships can sometimes be the most fragile. For Stevens, who was already navigating personal struggles, even ordinary romantic conflict could feel overwhelming. The argument they reportedly had on the night before her death has become one of the most discussed elements of the story. Not because it proves anything sinister, but because it underscores just how emotionally charged her final hours may have been. It's important to remember that a single argument does not define a tragedy. People argue every day and move on. But when someone is already carrying emotional burdens, even a seemingly routine disagreement can feel much heavier than it appears from the outside. That is why Stevens' death continues to resonate so deeply. It serves as a reminder that the battles people face are often invisible. Even those who seem to have everything, beauty, success, admiration, can be struggling in ways no one fully sees. The official ruling of suicide brought some closure, but not complete understanding. There are always questions in cases like this. Could someone have intervened? Were there signs that were missed? Was it truly intentional or a tragic accident? These questions linger because they speak to a universal human desire to make sense of loss. For Burt Reynolds, the experience must have been profoundly painful. To be connected forever to such a heartbreaking event is no small thing. Even without any wrongdoing, simply being part of someone's final hours can leave a lasting emotional imprint. His reluctance to speak about Stevens in later years suggests that the memory remained deeply personal. And perhaps that is exactly how he wanted it, not as a sensational Hollywood headline, but as a private sorrow. Inger Stevens' legacy deserves to be defined by far more than the circumstances of her death. She was a gifted actress whose work continues to captivate audiences. Her performances carried emotional honesty, warmth, and depth. She had the rare ability to make every character feel real, every moment feel genuine. There is something especially poignant about watching her performances today. Knowing what she was carrying beneath the surface adds a layer of complexity to her work. Her vulnerability on screen feels even more authentic in hindsight. As the years have passed, Stevens has become emblematic of a larger truth about Hollywood's golden age, that behind the glamour often lay profound personal struggles. Her story reminds us that fame cannot shield anyone from pain, nor can success guarantee happiness. Burt Reynolds would go on to enjoy an extraordinary career filled with iconic roles and public acclaim. Yet Inger Stevens remained a part of the story, a chapter marked not by scandal, but by sadness. Their relationship, however brief, became forever entwined with one of Hollywood's most enduring mysteries. In the end, Inger Stevens is remembered not just for how she died, but for how she lived. with elegance, talent, courage, and a quiet complexity that made her truly unforgettable. And perhaps that is the most important part of all. Long after the headlines faded, her work remained, her presence endured, and her story, though tragic, continues to touch hearts across generations. One of the most compelling aspects of Inger Stevens' life is how deeply she defied the image that Hollywood tried to place upon her. In an era when actresses were often expected to fit neatly into predefined roles, the glamorous blonde, the charming ingenue, the untouchable star, Stevens brought something far more layered to the screen. She was sophisticated, yes, but also vulnerable.